Welcome to Troon Talk, where we dig deeply into biodynamic, regenerative, organic farming and wine growing at Troon Vineyard in Oregon's Applegate Valley. Joining us today are our Director of Agriculture, Garett Long.
Hi, thank you.
And winemaker, Natew.
Hello.
Intentionality is foundational to the practice of biodynamic farming, and this requires a lot of planning. And in January, we make plans for the entire year. Our goal is to follow and encourage our soils and plants to follow the rhythms of nature, which drove their evolution. Following those natural cycles means not only following the flow of the seasons, but also paying attention to Earth's relationship to our solar system, especially the moon. Tracking those relationships is incredibly complicated. Fortunately, there are several calendars published to help guide us through making our plans for the year. To start, I'm going to ask Garett to talk a bit about the most important aspects of those calendars and the moon and the planetary relationships we're interested in following.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. You know, we really take our indications from Steiner's original lectures back in 1924. That's been, kind of summarized or called the agriculture course. Steiner referred to and pointed to these cosmic influences from the sun, the moon, planets, and the stars, the constellations as important factors that can be worked with or can be factors even working against us in agriculture. And he really challenged practitioners and the attendees of the course he was giving to experiment with these rhythms. And a very well-known practitioner, Maria Thun, a German practitioner, notably has done a lot of work since the 1950s, the early 1950s really, and she really contributed deeply to the creation of one of these calendars that Nate's going to talk about. But before we jump into those calendars, I want to say briefly that there is a real practical notion behind all of this. We want to talk about how in our farming practices we can incorporate lunar rhythms and other planetary rhythms to guide our practices, but ultimately it's really important to use common sense with an eye to the weather. And these lunar rhythms should really refine and enhance what we're doing rather than paralyze us. Or make it so that we are unable to, we're postponing decisions, for example, until just the most perfect time. So what I mean by that is we look first to the climate, before we care about, what zodiac the moon is in or whether it's a good day to be transplanting or pruning. We first look to just the weather. Is it pouring rain? We're not going to go out and drive our tractors in the rain. We're not going to be doing pruning in the rain, for example. It's something that's on our mind here in January. So those are just some of the basic tenets that we like to follow here is to be practical first and foremost rather than dogmatic about these lunar rhythms.
So Nate, we're using several calendars. Everybody has their favorite. Why don't you talk a bit about the calendars we use and what they tell us?
Yeah, sure. So, the more the merrier with these calendars. They often relay similar, if not identical, information, but they all do it in a slightly different way. This is because these rhythms of the solar system, of the planetary motions, the moon, how the moon travels both around the Earth and the solar system. Those are well known and can be predicted just mathematically as far into the future as you would like. So, all of these calendars have similar information about these movements, but they lay them out in a slightly different way, and it makes certain calendars, I guess, more helpful in different situations. And so, I guess one of the ones that we like to use is called the Celestial Planting Calendar, and right on the front of it, it says, "A guide to planting and harvesting using nature's rhythms and ancient wisdom." And I think this goes back to what Garett was saying is that, and I guess in the U.S. especially, people are maybe more familiar with the Farmer's Almanac, which is a very similar concept. It's trying to use natural rhythms that that farmers, agriculture has known for a while. I mean, in fact, just as a tangent, which I love to do, the reason humanity created calendars in the first place was for agriculture. So like we needed to have methods to figure out when to time the planting and the sowing of these different crops. And like, without timepieces, without things like this, we used the movement of planetary bodies in the sky as our calendars. So like, when the sun rose or set, in a certain constellation, that's how we knew what time of year it was. And so it's like, oh, well, this time of year, if we plant this crop, we know we'll be harvesting it at the right time. Mm-hmm. So like the use of calendars completely originated in agriculture, and farmers just had this intrinsic knowledge of how their crops responded to some of these different motions. So it was just, with the dawn of agriculture came the dawn kind of these calendar systems. And a lot of what this is doing is just trying to hold on to that knowledge that was gained, kind of over almost evolutionary time spans of humans, working with agriculture. So I think that's just an important point about why we even have these calendars. And I guess, Garett, maybe you want to talk about like on the calendars, like kind of some of those rhythms that we use, and like maybe the relative importance of different ones.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we're going through and planning out our biodynamic activities and our schedule for the year, one of the most important rhythms that we're paying attention to is the ascension and the descension. Is that the word? Descending movement of the moon. So Maria Thune called this running high and running low, referring to the apparent ascent and descent of the moon in the night sky over the course of a 2-week period. And so it's ascending for 2 weeks and then it reverses and appears to descend for 2 weeks. And that running high period is related to sort of the sap flows and the turgor pressure in the plants, meaning that as the moon is ascending, it has this gravitational pull upward, and it's influencing the growth of leaves as well as, more importantly, flowers and fruit. And during the opposite 2-week rhythm, there's more of a downward focus, meaning the plant may invest more energetic resources in growing roots rather than reproductive bodies. And so, again, these are really based on decades and decades of experimentation that Thune and other practitioners were doing throughout the world, really. And it's their body of experience that has shown that, especially when you use the biodynamic preparations to make your soil or your land more sensitive to cosmic influences, that a lot of this research has been based on continually refining our practices and informing our practices with these lunar rhythms. And that's one of the ones that's really important to us, is that ascending or descending movement of the moon. And Nate, that's really captured well. I mean, I'm looking at one of your calendars where you've highlighted that movement. Do you want to talk about maybe the Stella Natura calendar?
Yeah, and just to further your point on the moon, I think, interesting that you started with that ascending and descending. We haven't discussed phases of the moon, which is the most obvious to more people. They look up at the night sky. Sometimes they see a full moon. Sometimes they see, a crescent moon. And, so they know that the moon changes that way in a cyclical pattern. But perhaps it's a little less obvious. The sun does the same thing. And so like people are more used to the fact that in the winter, the sun is lower in the sky. And in the summertime, the sun is higher in the sky. That is a much longer annual cycle. The moon has a similar ascending and descending cycle. It just occurs much, much faster. And so, that is what the calendars, help us track that motion along with and in concert with the waxing and the waning of the moons. And I guess since I mentioned the sun, actually, like the most obvious cycle of all is the daylight cycle of the rising sun and the setting sun. And so to kind of double down on that ascending or descending moon, if the sun is rising versus the sun is setting, that's another upwards or downwards motion that we can kind of try to tap into. So certain practices that we're attempting to do that we want to emphasize that upward motion, those practices generally occur in the mornings, right? As the sun is rising and kind of amplifying that upward motion, whereas certain practices that we would be looking for a more downward or root-based, earth or water type connection to, we would do those in the afternoon when the sun is setting, and hopefully corresponding with the descending moon phase, things like this. Yeah. So,
Can I jump in real quick?
Yes,
yeah,
please.
I wanted to say, Steiner talked about the phases of the moon as well in his first lecture, and so I just wanted to quote him. He said, quote, "Something stupendous takes place on the earth as a result of the full moon's forces. These forces shoot into all the vegetative growth, but only if the full moon was preceded by some rainy days." I love that Steiner is being practical in this. He's like, yes, of course the full moon is going to influence this upward growth and sort of the movement of, I think of it as these, aromatic compounds in aromatic herbs, or these unique and complex flavors in fruits and seeds,
like
for example, like grapes, for instance. But he's very practical, and he says only if it's preceded by several days of rain. And, modern scientific studies have really confirmed this in many ways, showing that plant metabolism and growth and water absorption, that they tend to peak around the full moon. The ancient Romans knew this, and I thought it was funny, too, that my dad told me this when I was younger. He did a bit of logging in Washington for a short time. And the ancient Romans and my father advised that felling trees near the full moon would lead to further rot because the wood would contain too much moisture, that if you harvest it around the full moon, those sap flows make actually less quality wood. So there is real scientific evidence that supports all of this. It's I'm referring to these decades-long experimental studies, but there's evidence for this throughout the world and throughout several different industries, whether you consider forestry a part of agriculture or not, the USDA does. But I think there's really interesting outcomes to working with these lunar rhythms.
Yeah, so one of the things these calendars then help us track is both the ascending and descending of the moon, and basically the moon will continue ascending until actually there's a point where it passes what's called the ecliptic, which is kind of this plane that runs through our solar system that the planets orbit on. And the moon spends most of its time within this ecliptic, but does periodically go slightly above for a short period of time, and then on its downward trajectory, it will pass through the ecliptic and go below for a short period of time before it reaches its height or its I guess depth of its arc. But anyways, the calendars help us know when those times are, and then basically the column immediately after that is talking about the phases of the moon. So as Garett was mentioning, the full moon is a very different time for a plant than like a new moon, and so the phase of the moon is something else we can kind of work with. It's an added rhythm that can either amplify a certain effect that you're looking for, or can work in opposition to. So you can imagine that if you have an ascending moon at the same time as a full moon, there's a lot more upward kind of forces going on. But if you have that same ascending moon with more of a new moon situation, there's going to be a little kind of cancellation of some of those effects. So you can still, practically speaking, we'll still need to do some of these activities when it's most feasible from a weather perspective. Like, this isn't a dogmatic approach, but we can certainly try to plan out our year and pick the ideal dates well in advance, because as I mentioned, these cycles are, this is just math. We can, calculate when these different phases of the moon or different kind of planetary conjunctions occur. And so we can plan out an idealized schedule for the year. But when we're actually, in it, like, yes, the weather and other concerns maybe dictate exactly, but at least we know when we'd like to do these things.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that I think comes up a lot, if you've ever heard people talking about either, referring to the Farmer's Almanac or any of these planting calendars, we're associating the 4 elements of fire, air, water, and earth with different parts of the plant.
So the earth element is related to roots, fire is related to fruit or seed, water is related to stem and leaf, and air element is related to flowers. And so, we'll talk about doing certain practices like planting on a root day or harvesting on a fruit day. And so let's talk a little bit about where those ideas come from, I guess, because all plants have all of those parts over the course of their reproductive cycle. But as gardeners or as farmers, we're really interested in, for example, we want a grapevine with really good quality fruit. If it's got, of course it's got roots, but if it's an overly bushy grapevine with little fruit, then that leaf element has been accentuated as opposed to the fruit. Or conversely, in the vegetable garden, we want a radish root as opposed to radish flowers, or we want a lettuce leaf as opposed to the lettuce root, for instance. And so we can accentuate those plant parts that we desire to harvest or work with, depending on the movement of the moon. So Nate, we've been talking a lot about the orbit of the moon around the Earth and Earth's movement around the sun, as well as the planetary orbits. But also the moon and all of our planets are moving within the context of the greater constellations, right? The 12 zodiacs. So let's talk about the movement in that way.
So, again, most people are most familiar with the constellations of the zodiac in relation to astrology, which is, kind of goes on roughly a monthly time frame because it's related to where the sun is. Well, actually, where the sun was quite some time ago when the zodiac was first kind of set in stone in terms of the astrological significance. But this calendar does not use the astrological dates for the zodiac. It uses the astronomical dates for the zodiac. So if you think you've been living your whole life thinking you're a Leo, you may look in this book and find out that you are not, because that is not where the sun is actually rising and setting today. Thousands of years after they first came up with this, but.
I was devastated to find out I'm a Virgo. It just shook my whole worldview.
I am still a Leo, though, so I'm fine with that. Anyways, the zodiac in that context people are familiar with, but the moon also transits through all of these same constellations. The reason these constellations are important is because they lie on the ecliptic. That is how they can be used as a calendar, because the zodiacs will be on this plane, at different times of the year from a solar perspective. But the moon, since it's traveling around the Earth, does so much more rapidly. And so generally every 3 days or so, the moon will transit from one of these 12 constellations to another. And historically, these constellations have been tied with some of these different elements that Garett was discussing. Garett, do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, thank you. So exactly, every 2.5 days, the moon rotates into a new astrological sign. And so, as I was saying, let's take, you brought up Leo, for example. Leo is one of the 3 fire signs. And so when the moon is in a fire sign, such as Leo, this is considered a fruit day. This is a great day to be working with plants that we want to accentuate the fruit qualities. We keep talking about grapes because we're a winery, but also we grow tomatoes here. We grow squash in the garden. These are all fruit plants, so to speak, because that's the part of the plant that we want to accentuate.
Wait, a tomato is a fruit?
It is. It is. It has seeds. But, of course, a big bushy tomato plant that has that leaf element accentuated would be a disappointment, right? That's not exactly why we're growing tomatoes. And so I wanted to quote somebody else as well. Bernard Hack, an old biodynamic farmer as well, he described the moon as a kind of lens to focus the forces of the constellations, rather like a magnifying glass focuses the rays of the sun as it tries to ignite a fire with its heat. So meaning that, between the Earth and the constellation of Leo lies the moon, therefore magnifying or accentuating that fire element on Earth, influencing those fruit plants to accentuate those fruit qualities. And as we said, that rotates every 2.5 days and gives us a lot of opportunities to be working with different types of plants. It works really well in the vegetable garden, although it can be complicated quickly. But if you don't like the sign that that the moon is in, wait a couple of days and it might really start to line up perfectly. So we can start to plan some of our activities both on a weekly basis as well as zooming out as we do in the beginning of January as a team to plan our whole year's biodynamic practices, like for example to guide our prep making or harvesting of the prep plants, for example.
So you can already see that we've got kind of 4 rhythms that we've just discussed. We have the sun rising and setting. We have the moon basically rising and setting, ascending or descending. We have the phases of the moon that it's going through, and now we have this 4th rhythm of as the moon is moving, which constellation basically is it helping to focus, like Garett was mentioning. Is it that lens that's helping to focus a fire or fruit element, or is it a lens that's helping to focus water or leaf or stem elements? So all of these do not move in lockstep. However, they all have slightly different timings on their cycle, and in some cases quite a bit, right? 2.5 days versus a lunar cycle, which is more like 28 days for a full cycle. So that's why these calendars are necessary, because you need to look. There's no way of intuiting what this is going to be, and each year the calendar shifts a little bit from where it was the prior year. So because these rhythms don't perfectly overlap, so they'll be staggered, and so sometimes during this is for me, when I'm looking for harvesting, say starting in mid-September or so in October, I would idealize be looking for something like, say, we're working with fruit, right? So we would want fundamentally to be working in a fruit time. We want what Garett was talking about, trying to bring up all these aromatics, up all these interesting compounds into the grapes. So we would be wanting to look at ascending times. Ideally then, right, the sun is rising. We want to be harvesting in the morning. We generally always do that anyways, but that's a rising. We would prefer to have an ascending moon. We would prefer to have that moon be in front of one of the fire signs or fruit days to help focus that fruit energy, cosmologically speaking, and the trifecta would be, or quadfecta, whatever that is, would be if we could also then have a waxing or a in kind of enlarging moon, just all of these upward forces. That's just an example of trying to link up all of those different rhythms we've been discussing for the purpose of, in this case, trying to pick grapes at a particular time to try to emphasize everything we want that grape to be.
Yeah. Perfect.
And ascending and descending are relatively long periods, so a farmer has a lot of latitude to work within those.
Yeah, those 2-week periods, again, that research that Maria Thun did really demonstrated, she even called it just transplanting time. That 2-week period of descending moon is a great time to be transplanting your crops from your greenhouse into your garden, to be sowing seeds, I didn't mean to say to be sowing seeds. That's better to do in the ascending moon. But to be transplanting along with those downward rhythms, it does give you that 2-week period to hopefully find that specific leaf day, fruit day period within that 2 weeks. That would be really favorable. And Nate, we've covered the 2 calendars, the Celestial Planting Calendar, the Stella Natura Calendar, and I've brought up Maria Thun several times, and her family carries on her legacy. She passed away
2012, I believe.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, It wasn't that long ago. And so her sons, I believe, are carrying on her legacy and continue to publish the Maria Thun Biodynamic Almanac for 2024. And there's some really unique stuff here too that's really guiding, for instance, our prep work with these vegan preparations or log preparations. We buried yarrow blossoms in a birch log recently to great effect. So let's talk about some of the differences with the Maria Thun Almanac.
Yeah, so this Maria Thun Biodynamic Almanac 2024, this is more, it is a calendar, but it's more in booklet form as an almanac. And as Garett mentioned, Maria was the one who really did decades, like 50 years worth of experimentation in her own garden on trying different processes at different different combinations of lunar cycles and of these constellations, fire sign, earth sign, water sign, and just looking through. Now this almanac doesn't have these pictures, but other books of hers do, and just looking at the pictures, this is harvested on this day, this is harvested on that day, or this was planted in this phase, this was planted in that phase. Shockingly different, and it's just from her little patch of garden in Germany, and decades of experience kind of brought her to this understanding that as Garett mentioned, it's like these lectures in the 20s. I should mention that 1924, so it's the 100 years of biodynamics. Were just the starting point, and there was this call to go forth and experiment, like find how this works, just on a broader scale, but also for each individual farm. And obviously with biodynamics, that farm organism and the individuality of each farm is very important. And so an understanding of your own place in the world is part of what biodynamics is hoping to have you learn. So these calendars are some of the ways we do that. But in the almanac here, the Troon Almanac is more information on some of the timings of these biodynamic preparations, both in terms of how we might want to harvest the raw materials to make them, when we might want to actually make them and or bury them or hang them, or we can. This is a deep dive. This will be a separate topic that we will get into, but and then specifically, like Garett mentioned, there was a time in Europe with mad cow disease going on where the practitioners were not able to use any of the animal parts that are often associated with some of these biodynamic preparations. Steiner often linked, not all the preparations, but several of the preparations have a link between like a plant or herbal element and then an animal element. Sheathing is what they called it. So like a plant element wrapped in an animal element. And during this time, they were unable to use those elements. And so Maria Thun did what she did best, is she started experimenting with all these other ways of having non-animal based sheathing, basically, and came up with these log biodynamic log preparations, substituting specific species of trees for different types of biodynamic preparation use, and through experimentation found great success in the creation of these. So that is something that Troon has been experimenting with as well. We have been doing this in concert with the more traditional biodynamic preparations, but Garett, I want you to just you just came back from this great prep makers conference gathering, and talk a little bit about that.
Thanks. I did have the opportunity to attend the annual gathering of the Fellowship of the Preparation Makers.
Great name.
Fantastic name. Great group. True fellowship was found and cultivated over this 4-day gathering in Northern California. And we culminated that the final event was a sensory evaluation by about the 50 of us that attended this gathering. And it was such an amazing experience. The whole gathering focused on 2 preparations, 502, the yarrow prep, and 507, the valerian preparation. And many of us brought examples of our own preps, and we did basically a blind sensory evaluation. It was really neat to go in silence in this room and take the caps off of all of these mason jar lids containing each of these preparations made by a different practitioner or different group of practitioners from all over the country, and to evaluate them, to smell them, to meditate on them. There was some energetic evaluation going on by certain people there. And surprisingly enough, there are versions of consensus that were reached about the quality, and I think a lot of that comes through experience and just your own
personal sensory perception of them. But to get to the point, we brought our yarrow preparation that was prepared in the birch log. Again, not the way that Steiner indicated, but the way that Troon indicated. And it was put as one of the 11 yarrow preps. It was secret. And as it was revealed, everybody was asked, hey, what'd you think of number 11? Was that a good? How would you rate it on a scale from 1 to 5? And there were a lot of 5s shown up, which is the highest quality. There was good consensus about the quality. It was transformed. It was colloidal in nature. It was this dark colloidal smear on it. And a lot of people really felt that energetically it was a beautiful preparation, which I think surprised a lot of people in the room as well. And so I think it's just really encouraging for us to continue on with this experimentation, to really follow in the legacy of Troon, and to continue to reflect as an individuality of our farm and the nature of our farmers to pursue these experiments further. And so maybe just kind of in closing, we can talk about what these rhythms really mean to us on our farm, and yes, how you incorporate them, but really why, what does it matter? What does it all mean to you?
One thing, I want to go back to what you were just saying, because I love that it was a little bit of like a gotcha moment, you know, where like supposedly we were supposed to be presenting our traditional biodynamic preparations for evaluation. It's kind of like bringing some like 16% alcohol wine to this like, you know, minimal intervention, like low alcohol, like wine tasting, and just like blind people on it. And like every once in a while you can find this amazingly balanced, you know, high alcohol wine. People will love it. And you're like, actually, you know, this is not at all what you were thinking. And so I think it's kind of funny, but also really encouraging that that's exactly what happened with our own experimentation. And experimentation is something we love to do in all aspects of what we do here. We do it in the winery all the time. We've had several podcasts on that, but we also do it in our vineyards. And I'd like you to just, you've described before the practice of biodynamics, and this kind of feeds into what we've been talking about. And I'd like your explanation for that, if you could give it again.
Sure. Yeah. I really have found in my about 10, 11 years of practicing biodynamics that it is truly a practice, that the more times, every season is an opportunity to go out there and practice again in the making of these preparations, the planting of trees, all of our farming practices that are guided by, you know, these indications given by Steiner and built upon by all of the practitioners over the last 100 years. We really do stand on the shoulders of giants. And what I've gained from my own personal practice is a deeper sense and a deeper sense of the influences, the relationships between planetary influences, elements, plants, and their uses on the farm. We're really excited to experiment more deeply this season with some of these prep plants and preparations, using them in novel ways, and like, for example, using more nettle teas and equisetum teas. And I think my appreciation for the practice, and this is really the meaning of all of this, both biodynamics and lunar rhythm specifically, I find it to be a humbling practice. I find it to be I find myself recognizing that I'm a very, very small part of this whole universe and the movements and rhythms within it. And so while it's both humbling, it's also inspiring to recognize that we can leverage these forces for good, for healing the planet, for growing more nutritious crops, for healing our relationships as well to both land and to each other. And so I find this inspiration in the kind of greater cosmos. And while it's not always possible to incorporate or to address all of these rhythms, I still find inspiration in it, and try to bring that into my farming practice and make every year better than the last.
And kind of speaking along those lines, I was reminded as we were going through setting up our 2024 annual, biodynamic practices like schedule, of how far we've come. So in 2018, speaking of this being a practice, right when Troon was first transitioning into biodynamics and organic viticulture, regenerative practices here, our Our 2018 biodynamic schedule was like about a page and a half. And we talked about the first two preparations that we personally made on our farm here was preparation 500 and 501. So the kind of the foundational preparations in biodynamics, the yin and the yang, the upward and the downward, the kind of the cow manure cow horn preparation, as well as the silica cow horn preparation, and that's just where we started. And so we just had some information on that and the timing of the applications on that, and that was our 2018 schedule. Fast forward to 2024, it's now like our 8 or 9 page document. We go through all of the preparations, barrel compost, we talk about various field sprays, and we continue to try to integrate more. And this year we're trying to go beyond just the kind of prescribed uses of many of these biodynamic preparations, which most of them are for the compost pile specifically, and to help enliven different aspects of the compost, such that when the compost is applied on the land, it does receive the benefits of these various biodynamic preparations to aid the plants in various aspects of its physiology, which we'll go into later in a further episode. But trying to move beyond some of these and using some of these preparations directly for uses in our vineyard on our farm. So again, this is a practice, and year after year we've continued to develop it, and we get comfortable with working with certain aspects, and it's time to kind of keep going further and experimenting more and adding more onto our 2024 schedule, such that it's now 9 pages long, and I'm sure 2025 will be 10 pages long. And but that's kind of the fun and the excitement of doing it. And it is, I think, a great way of learning biodynamics. Is and this is as we first started, our biodynamic consultant Andrew Beatty said, biodynamics shouldn't be a chore. If you try to just jump in and do all these things, you're going to see them just as a chore, and you will not have the intention that Craig started this whole podcast with, because you'll just see it as something you need to do, and it will be really hard to have the intention necessary behind that act of making these preparations, of applying them, because it's just one more thing you need to check off. But if you start layering these slowly over time, and you see the rationale behind it, you see the application, and you see the results of that application, you're excited to add on to that and to kind of continue deepening that practice, on your farm organism that you're continuing to learn more about. So I think that that's why it's fun for us to sit down in January and think about what we're going to be doing this whole year, setting that intention, and but embracing it with excitement, not dread of how long our schedule is getting.
We always think of these things in terms of agriculture and farming, but Nate, you mentioned your harvest decisions are impacted, but also seller decisions are affected by these rhythms. What are some of the considerations you have to take into account?
Yeah, that's right, and that is a much less well-defined aspect of biodynamics. Biodynamics in the vineyard, in the garden, in the farm are much more, I guess, studied, and there's more publicized literature of people who've tried different things and failed on some and succeeded on others, and there's a more, I guess, well-trodden path in that some of the biodynamics in the cellar is perhaps a little less obvious, a little less intuitive, but we do certainly follow these rhythms as much as we can. For example, bottling is an easy example. We have to schedule our bottling about a year out anyway. We use a mobile bottling truck that comes onto our site. It's great. I love not having to have our own bottling line because the bottling line shows up. There's someone whose job is every day of the year to run this bottling line. They can dial everything in a couple minutes. They have every spare part necessary in case something goes wrong. It's just great. If you have your own bottling line, you only use it a couple times a year. Inevitably, something breaks or doesn't work when you try to start it up, and it's frustrating. And bottling's already, kind of traumatic enough. And so, yeah, this is great. But because we have to schedule these so far in advance, I basically try to get the biodynamic calendar as early as I can in the fall when they release it, and then I immediately send an email to the bottling company and said, okay, great. I have 3 bottlings this year, and my preferred dates are this, this, and this. And sometimes they like say, oh, well, we can't do, March 15th, but how about the 16th? And I'm like, actually, that's not going to work. How about April 2nd? And they're like, wait, what? I don't even understand what you're doing. And it's like, yes, I know you wouldn't think one day would make a difference, but hey, if I have my pick of all days, I'm going to pick the best ones. So yes, there are some things we do. Racking is kind of an obvious one. If you're trying to rack wine off of its lees, it's a good time to do that would be during a lot of these descending rhythms that we've talked about. When the lees will likely be more compact at the bottom of the barrel, say. So if you're trying to take the wine out and leave settled material behind, try to work with those descending rhythms, both if you can, starting after lunch, but then certainly lunar elements as well. Working with fruit signs as you can, because again, ultimately we want that fire or fruit element. We're working with wine. We want to accentuate that element. Although sometimes, if secondarily, if you're working with certain types of white wines and you just can't get the calendar to work out and get the stars to literally align for fruit, a flower is a good alternative, especially if you've got some aromatic white wines with these floral characteristics. That's not a bad second option, and it just gives you more options to try to get done what you need to get done to make the bottling happen. So that's one example of a rhythm. Bottling might be a little different. You might want to make sure that the wine is expressing its characteristics more fully. So instead of some of those descending characteristics, you might want ascending characteristics when that wine gets put in the bottle, because puts in the bottle, gets a cork on it. It's a little bit setting things in amber, although Troon's wines, since we are, we're very minimal intervention, we don't use additives, we don't fine, we don't filter. Our wine continues to be a living and breathing thing, even in the bottle. So it hasn't been sterile filter. It hasn't had the life literally removed from that product. So ours may not be as set in amber as others, which is a beautiful thing. It allows for the evolution of that wine after bottling, which is kind of why you want to set that starting point as best you can. So if I can get these perfect dates on the calendar, I will select those for bottling. But every once in a while, you can't make that happen. And you might try to do a second or even a third tier. But it's better than, having no intention. Again, it all comes back to intention. It's better than having no intention on those bottling dates or racking dates, or just, picking a date randomly out of thin air. It's like, at least we have intention behind what we're doing, and we can strive to work with these rhythms as much as possible.
Yeah, you can grow good produce without following these rhythms, but I always look at trying to achieve these precise dates and alignments is going for that extra quality, that extra little edge, that tomato that has more flavor, the wine that has more life in it, and I think it's worth it to invest that time if you're going for peak experience.
Well, I like thinking about this in terms of like the Olympics. You look at all these top athletes competing, and like the times, fractions of a second are the difference between being on the podium and not. And like the same way as like when, in the world of wine, there's, thousands of participants, hundreds of thousands of participants, and a lot of really great wine out there being made, more so than any time of history. We have just such great choices out there spread before us. And the difference of, a fraction of a second or just that like little bit can make the difference between a really good wine and a great, amazing wine. And so, yeah, if we have all things working for us, that might just be that little fraction of a second that pushes it over the edge.
Yeah, it's that cherry on top, right? I mean, Craig, you brought Biodynamics to Troon back in 2017, 2018, and you've watched this evolution to go from just making 500 and 501 to this now 10-page document and this intensive planning experience. I think Biodynamic as a practice I've heard you describe as really meaningful. Can you speak to what these lunar rhythms, I know you've been also inspired by like the fertilization effect of the moon and some recent scientific studies on that. What do these rhythms mean to you?
Well, first of all, I think the goal is to connect to natural rhythms. You know, the way that the natural soil system evolved to work, the way the plant evolved to work, and they all evolved in this environment with the plant, the moon, and these cycles. And you referred to these were the calendars that people had in the past. There's interesting research now. You know, the moon obviously is a huge part of this process we go through, and people tend to automatically think, oh, it's the gravity. They relate it to the tides. But now there's this new research that's come out with there's a scientist in Italy who has looked at that increased plant activity you referred to, but they connect it to the reflected light of the moon, and that's a cycle. There's some American scientists discovered that the moon has a tail, and once a month this tail, like a comet, and once a month that tail comes across the Earth, and it's primarily made of sodium. Now, what do these things mean? We don't really know, and I think that's the interesting part of biodynamics. There's so much that we don't know, and biodynamics, I think, respects that. So, do we know why the moon is doing all these things? Not necessarily, not yet, anyway. So, I think that's the part is that you're looking and you see improvement. We've seen improvement in our wines and our soils and so forth. So we know these things are working. We just don't always know exactly which parts.
I thank you, Craig. I'm most definitely motivated by that myself. Sort of asking the questions of why and building experimentation and research projects around trying to figure out the why behind biodynamics is personally very motivating to me. I did my master's degree in soil science, and I've been a biodynamic farmer for more than a decade. And while those two may seem at times at odds with each other, a very strict land-grant university UC Davis approach to agriculture versus biodynamics as on the other end of the spectrum involving spiritual science and lunar rhythms, there's a perception that these may be at odds with one another, and yet I find this beautiful balance in using the scientific method and to really refine our questions to better understand these cosmic influences and how that cherry on top can really make a wine, push a wine into that excellence. I'm personally motivated by that too.
Okay. So, it's quite the process. We'll be sharing more of this in the future, going over kind of a month-by-month plan. It takes hours and hours to work all this out, but we really feel it's really a good investment of our time, and we feel that we are making things better. In an upcoming podcast, we'll be looking at that, and we'll also be having an in-depth discussion on the cycles of the moon itself. So we will continue to build on this topic, and thank you, Garett and Nate.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
We are happy to share this podcast from Troon Vineyard, a Demeter Biodynamic and Regenerative Organic certified winery in Oregon's Applegate Valley. We farm like the world depends on it by growing produce in our gardens and naturally crafting authentic wines. We will be sharing these in-depth podcasts several times a month. To learn more, I encourage you to visit our website at troonvineyard.com and those of the Regenerative Organic Alliance at regenorganic.org and Demeter Biodynamics at demeter-usa.org. Thanks for sharing our voyage to regenerative agriculture with us.